Tippity Chad, Cornel, Pewewardy, Quahada. I want to greet you in my traditional way. The song that I just sang is a Kiowa flag song, giving respect for the warriors that have gone to battle, not only in a contemporary way for this country, but also in the past, that we see ourselves in the eyes of our people. And so as I begin, I give acknowledgement to the ancestors. And first, the ancestors that are here in this community, what we call Multnomah County, that being the Clackamas, Tualatin, and the Multnomah, the people that are a part of the Middle Chinook. That's whose ancestral lands these are, in which we work. Many of us work, and many of us play. Many of us have our careers and our lifeways right here in the ancestral lands. And so that's where I begin. I give credit to where we come from. And so I'd like to say thank you, because I come from a warrior tradition, and I'm echoing what I've been taught in my day from my people, my grandparents, and all the teachers in my life here as I stand before you as an Indigenous person. And so what I'm about to tell you and share with you is nothing new that hasn't already been echoed throughout the years. And I bought a lot of knowledge-based books that talk about the Indigenous manifestos that we present to try to make things right for us in this country. But the powers to be have to listen and be active and work with Indigenous communities to make it right. And so that's what my presentation is, to see how things are in the world. Where are we in this moment in time, 2014? To walk a mile in my red face, 500 years amongst the settlers and counting, but for me, counting coup as an Indigenous warrior. And so I began to understand what that really means in this day and age. Somebody that's in academia, trying to push back layer after layer of Eurocentric lenses and to try to remain Indigenous is the hardest act that any one person could try to be today. And particularly for young Indigenous people, that is the hardest act to be, to try to speak your own language, to try to affirm your own tribal culture, and to wear your traditional regalia at graduation ceremonies. And because I have my cap in my graduation, I think back into the days where this was prohibited for me. And still today in 2014, many places across the country, many of our Native students that graduate from high school and colleges are still prohibited from wearing their traditional regalia at graduation ceremonies all over the country. And so we have a lot of work to do, not only with ourselves, within our communities, our Indigenous communities, because of colonization, but we work with our allies, and that's what we try to do, many of us. And so we open up our classrooms. Our Indigenous Nations Studies program is for everybody, not just our people itself, because we see in a world that we have to coexist. It's important. And so that's what this presentation is a reminder. And so I begin to talk about how I see the world in Indigenous eyes. Let's see, is this working? And so as we began to look at the maps of the world, this is a portrait of Jim Damone, Anishinaabe. he looks at the world through indigenous eyes. So this is a part of his construction of the United States of America. And so I'm not going to linger on all of the items and the icons that are part of this, but it's a reminder of the doctrine of despair that many of us have as we look at this world, and that many times we're too fast to fast forward life and forget about the atrocities that had occurred in the past. And so this is a part of that. And so much of what my voice is echoing, that we have a cultural, we have a tribal memory that we know, and many of us that have lived through the civil rights still live the rights of activism in the work that we do. As we began to see the idea of what this country looked like prior to contact in 1492, where are we? Do many of the people? That is the one reason I acknowledge the ancestral lands of where we are today, to give recognition to those people whose lands are still a part of that cultural memory. And so we began to look at this clash of worldviews. And how did this happen? Because it continues to be a part of the academic landscape as we begin to push the story of our own identities, our truth, our stories, our creation, and where we come from. And we look at what I see a paradigm shift in my day in the civil rights, being a part of the American Indian movement in the 70s and the 80s. And here I am in my 60s, and I come from a warrior tradition. I'd rather live now than any time in history. And I have a proud history. We've always fought settlers. I'm Comanche. I'm Kiowa. That is our territorial land. But as we begin to look at what I see here, now I'm beginning to see the tip of the iceberg in this sustainability movement, where many of the United States Western cultures are still, they're trying to work with us because we come from wisdom cultures. There is this paradigm shift of postmodernism coming together, starting to see the ways of life that have always had with us within our indigenous lifeways. And so that's much of what we teach. So where do I start in this day and age? And so much of my classes said, start with Columbus. And so I'm Columbusing. So I'm looking at the achievement gap as we see it in education. My theory is in 1492. And so as we begin to look at that legacy of despair, what do we see? What do you see that I see that is very obvious and where we are, particularly as we look at the social ills and the status of where we are? Look at what happened in this exchange of land, exchange of resources, and look how we have been resilient to these changes, particularly not only in the resources and the grains and all the plants, but look at the diseases that were implanted over here in Turtle Island in North America. Our indigenous people were not immune to these kinds of diseases. As you begin to think about this, that is really important. And so from that, coming over from the Americas to Europe, in that cycle of the Columbia Exchange is very obvious. And so many of my students are just now becoming familiar with the story of indigenous peoples. And so as I began to look, how did this happen? And for me, there's 5 steps to colonization. 1, settlers take the indigenous land and natural resources. 2, the settlers would take indigenous children. 3, the settlers would take indigenous religion and spirituality. 4, the settlers would take away our teaching and learning methodology. And 5, the settlers will even debate the concept of tribal sovereignty. So as you begin to look at just 2 doctrines, I have 8 doctrines of despair, but this is probably the most pronounced. It's called the doctrine of discovery. because it's still a part of the American landscape and discourse, particularly in many colleges and universities across the campus. There's still this debate upon whether or not to have Columbus Day or not Columbus Day. I mean, that is an issue here in 2014. That was my discussion in civil rights. And so as I began to look at where's that concept, that mind that has been frozen in time to where we are today. And so as I began to look at this doctrine, how did it impact the world? Well, you can see the world population shifted. And it's not so much a part of not a part of the war, but it was the diseases, the smallpox, the measles, and the chickenpox that we were not immune to. That's the culprit as you begin to look at the percentage change in the native population. And then the second doctrine is the doctrine of manifest destiny with Lady Liberty, as you begins to look in this image in many of the picture books where I grew up in public schools in America. And so here we are in 2014, just now approaching this idea. And so I'm trying to be selective and point out a few things that make me see red in the world in which we live. And so I'll be go ahead and continue with some of those. But it left us with a legacy of despair and looking at how it's dehumanized a lot of people, not just indigenous people, but so many people that have been underserved in this country, and looking at the elevation of theories of those that have elevated to the chosen race and those of us that come from default race and how it's portrayed in history books. And what's the culprit? Systemic design is by interrupting culture. And you interrupt culture by teaching your children not to speak their tribal language. You teach your children not to pray to the Creator in which their families have always prayed to. And you cut their hair. You give them anglicized names. You make them kneel and pray to a Creator, a God that is foreign to them. And then you traumatize them. And it's caused an intergenerational grief that we're still confronting this day, because many of our people, our students, cannot speak their tribal language and cannot affirm their culture in reenactment in traditional ways because of this interference in our families, because somebody else took care of our education from them. And this is one sample. And for those of you that have children and grandchildren, you could see how young these children are. They're started at the age of 4, all the way up to the older ones. And so as you begin to think about your own families, how would you think if somebody took your children 3, 4 states away on a train, and you're never going to see them for months at a time, and many times years? Or worse, they're not going to return to you because they got sick. And there was no medicine to cure all of the diseases these children had. So those are cultural memories stuck and burnt into the psyche of many of us. And so we are dealing with this intergenerational trauma. This educating the Indian, the idea of educating the Indian, beating the Eurocentric ideas into their learning. And what happened? It turned into the before and after you attend Carlisle Indian schools. In just 3 years, the transformation of cognition. But we know there's resistance. We've been fighting 500 years of resistance in European schooling. And I've just listed a few things. The detribalization and relocation of all of the indigenous peoples from the reservations to urban cities, the closing our boarding schools, fewer indigenous teachers and principals, the increase in special ed has skyrocketed to our people. And then the use of invalid psychological examinations, the discipline. The tribal colleges are threatened by predominantly white universities, anti-Mexican American curriculum in schools like Tucson. And then many white teachers are disconnected from the indigenous students. And then in academia, higher education, predominantly helicopter research, where the researcher flies in from the research university and conducts their research on our people, and then they fly back. And the people do not benefit whatsoever from that research. That is famous. That is the issue within research universities where I come from. So I move into what causes and what maintains this stratification. I call it power and control. Now start with images, because images have everything to do with what we see, what we hear, how we interpret the world. And so I live in a world where I have to interpret many of the perceptions. And so I ask students, what do they see in the world? Because I have a different type of lens for myself. And so I look at the ability to articulate the concept and idea of reality to another individual, a group of people, and convince them that their imposed reality is real and genuine. And if anybody of authority can do that for somebody that's younger or somebody in part, then they have total power and control over their cognition, because they have not gone through their own type of process of critical thinking. And so as I began to look at what caused this, and for me, I think about the settler mentality that many of us have gone through. So we go through these institutes of higher education, but for me, I look at the metaphor of a double-edged sword. On one side, we had this sharpened blade to try to destroy our cultures using education. And here on the other side is where we are today in higher education, using critical thinking to liberate ourselves, to create new nations that are tribal, that were once tried to be destroyed, and looking at the settler colonization, and then looking at settlers of color, which is my version of saying, even that you're of color in the community, but you have the ideology of a settler. And so you look at the indigenous peoples and what had caused that. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is trying to unpack the lenses of what we see or what we don't see, and whose lens do we look at. And so for 30 years, I've been paying close attention, because I have the time and the energy to do so, to try to unpack the Indian mascot debate. But still there's much resistance. But just like the other slide, I know what resistance is. 500 years of European resistance to this kind of issue that happens every Friday night football, every Saturday football, and every Sunday professional football leagues, football, baseball, but every sport has this kind of phenomena of playing Indian. And it's an assault. It's assault. And somebody that's a former elementary teacher and school principal, I know this has much to do with our mission statements and affirming diversity and anti-discrimination, and then looking at what creates a hostile environment. Because if you create a hostile environment, that's when protests come up. That's why I have received multiple complaints and worked with the Office of Rights, Commission Rights on Civil Rights, and then for the past 10 years working with the NCAA, trying to design policy to eliminate this masquerade that's happening on weekends. And so you see, this colonialization of college sports is not only within the sports arena, but it's also in the media and how they portray it. That's why we look at our own selves. We have our own indigenous media and our forums in which we get things out. And many times we have to work with allies to help them clarify what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. And so we say, okay, what about if we change things, change the paradigm, and make fun of people like they're making fun of us, and tell them, we're honoring you. I wonder how that would be. I'm going to set up a little audio cue and help you understand what it means to be honored, and talking about
It's halftime at Jimmy Hoffa Memorial Stadium, where the Kansas City Jews are being nailed by the Minnesota Scandinavians 24-7. I'm Don McKay.
And I'm Jim McVeigh.
And let's check the scoreboard from around the country.
In the AFC, in the first quarter, it's the Milwaukee Krauts 3, the Pittsburgh Negroes nothing. In second quarter action, the Miami Cubans are walloping the Cincinnati Czechoslovakians 38-3.
And Jim, I don't want to hear anything from you about bounced checks. Finally, in the NFC, the Cleveland Caucasians are edging the Indianapolis Indonesians 7-6 in the third quarter. Boy, I can hear that crowd in Cleveland now. Go, Whiteys, go!
This halftime update brought to you by Generated Motors, makers of the sleek Air Chicano, the thrifty, hard-working Asian, and the sporty new Filipino.
That's right, Jim. And now let's go back on the field, where the wacky mascot of the Kansas City Jews, Myron the Dancing Yarmulke, is getting ready to light the third quarter menorah to get this second half underway.
Okay, so you can see how we can spin that and try to make people understand, and particularly the young minds that are conditioned to sports culture, to see how it would that we're spinning your culture and giving you the opportunity to see how America looks at you. And then even so, tell you in your face, in your children's face, we're honoring you in this kind of way. So that's some of the things we're talking about. And this is one of the more finer schools, a private school in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm from Oklahoma. And this is Tulsa Union. And I don't know if you have cheerleaders and yell leaders in your family, but you know, this is an enactment. I don't know, it's empirical nostalgia to me, but these girls are evidently doing a woo, 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 and I don't, you know, the idea was, where did they learn that? And so I began to think about just how it could be a cool outfit. So what sports mascot are you, or Disney character? And so the reality hits home and where we're coming from, particularly if you come from people that have been forced to relocate from your ancestral land. And so for me, coming from the homeland, which is Oklahoma for me, meaning the land of the red people, Oklahoma. And so therefore you're looking at all the forced relocations. And you can see over here in Oregon, one of the tribes is the Bodog, which is southern Oregon. They have also been removed, but now since they've come back to the state of Oregon. But that's forced removal in Indian territory. And so what this means, particularly in Heritage Days, as you look at trying to celebrate multicultural education in our schools, it's more than just fads and foods and festivals. It's about the history, and whose history are we telling? And how did this land become mostly occupied from settlers and its ancestral land? So you have to look at these land rush issues, and particularly for me, and this is the Oklahoma land rush in 1889. As we look at the traditions of the boomers and the Sooners and the land rush and how that came to be because of the creation of these territorial lands. And so we look at 125 years of the Dawes Act that gave the United States legislation to create the opportunity for settlers to obtain this type of land. And so we're looking at how did this happen? This legacy of allotment, but profound loss of land from tribal ownership to Indian ownership, stolen, graft, bribery, hardships, and tax foreclosures for most of the tribes, and the termination, and the many tribes that were terminated here in the state of Oregon that are now being reconstituted, coming back as a tribal, proud nation. And those are my students. Those are my service areas. That's who I work for. That's my primary population. And that is nation building. We're coming back where the government terminated them at one time. And so we're looking at more economic results of what happens and how difficult it is even to try to get your land back in the legislation, the problems of factionization, and what has occurred through the times. Even if you have land, you have so many heirs that you have to go through to the Bureau of Land Management and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to even lease your land, not just to sell it, and how this would happen from the original allottees. And so you're looking at what we have today, the American dream. It created an indigenous nightmare. It created the birth of a settler nation. As you began to look at the many books that we have and exposed to our students about where we're coming from through indigenous eyes. That's the history, not just from the eyes that told to like Howard Zinn and James Lowell, Eliza, my teacher, told me, but those are the books that are helping us work with allies to tell a different picture than the Columbus story. And then look at that, American dream. Is that a dream for everybody? Evidently, for the people that I'm close to and I love, it is not, because you begin to look at the demise of all the statistics that we have and looking at the lower rung of the social ladder and where we are today. The Multnomah County People Culture Colors of Report indicates that we're still on the lower rung of status here in Multnomah County. And little things that we try to bring up is trying to reconsider Thanksgiving. we still have that rub and an opportunity to educate the people that are a part of proclaiming Thanksgiving and looking at it and sometimes using trickster theory and say, it's not Thanksgiving, it's Thanks-taking. So as you begin to look at how we deal with this holiday, it becomes not so much a microaggression, but sometimes an assault, like the sports mascot, and the transformation of the holiday, and how did it occur, and more so important, in teaching the truth, and who knows what about this country, and alternatives. There's all kinds of alternatives, not just for Thanksgiving, but for Columbus Day, for the 4th of July, Liberation Day, and it goes on and on, not only with the holidays, but all our symbols, our statues, our reminder of who's in charge and who's not in charge of our stories. And then we start to look at how children are impacted. Here we have Halloween coming up, and I'm very much moved and disturbed that I might see this happening. Not only Halloween, but costume parties and heritage days. And I'm thinking, where did these children learn this behavior? And then I look at grown-ups as began to portray and try to look at what they perceive as honorable. Are you familiar with this picture? Who might this be? That's the governor of the state of Oklahoma. Who is this picture? The sisters of the Kardashians. So as you begin to look, where is their consciousness in looking at the people that we're trying to represent? Because it comes from a white identity performance. It's how they perceive who we are, and they play it out. But the trouble is, they play it out, and they're surrounded by young people who have not gone through that critical consciousness. And so they begin to play and portray and perpetuate an enigma, what I call empirical nostalgia. So they look at what they perceive is real. And this is far remote from my reality. So far that I call it disconsciousness, DYS, like in dysfunctional, that they're so far removed from the reality that they don't even know that they're right and wrong. And so as we begin to look at trying to unpack this in their own discourse, using somebody else's language, using English to combat this issue is even more challenging, because we know we live in a world that's created this language of savagery. When people say, hey, chief, or even they say, low man on the totem pole, let's powwow, circle the wagons, honest Injun. Another microaggression assault has happened over. But just to bring it up is even detrimental and embarrassing for many of our students. And that's where this concerns me. And we have that nomenclature that is prevalent in the powers to be, because even with the Osama bin Laden, the code name for that program was called Geronimo, already portraying the binary of the good guy and the bad guy. So it lives on and on and on, not only in our life, but in sci-fi. And so we look at the hierarchies of power and control, and we look at what we're doing and what we can do about it. What can we do to work this out, to turn this pyramid around? We have challenges to overcome within our own self. We have the ability to look at ourselves through our own eyes and work with our allies of all colors and to work together for this inequality. And many of us are going back to the traditions of what work and decolonizing our own minds and coming to our own mindfulness, using the traditions of what work and what we call culturally responsive practice and evidence-based practice and ceremonies and songs and dancing and meditation and mindfulness, because that's who we are. That's our people. That is our tradition, our proud tradition that we're moving into, and we're bringing on allies to help them understand that element. But of course, we still have this clash of cultures that won't understand our way or even bring them along, because that empirical nostalgia, that empirical cognition is blocking us from doing this. So I present that to you in a very fast-paced, and I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to echo what I have learned and what I talk about every day in my practice as a professor in a predominantly higher education university. And so many times my students say, yeah, that's very challenging. Well, what can I do? I said, what you can do is learn the truth, because change happens one warrior at a time. Thank you very much.